Today's scripture reading will come from Numbers 35, verses 29 through 34. Numbers chapter 35, verses 29 through 34. And these things shall be a statute of judgment to you throughout your generations and all your dwellings. Whoever kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall take no ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest. So you shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land. And no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Therefore, do not defile the land which you inhabit, in the midst of which I dwell. For I, the Lord, dwell among the children of Israel.
For our visitors, I want to mention, I know everybody else already understands this, but once a month we have a question that is given by maybe a member of our church or just someone visiting our assemblies and wants to know the answer of that. And we actually began this one last month. I know that we didn't get to finish it, and that was by design. There's a lot to this one, so we're having I'd say somewhat rare, not entirely unique, but a somewhat rare part two on this. And our question is this: why has the collective church historically condemned the killing of abortionists? Is an abortionist not a murderer? And is not one who takes the life of an abortionist, saving many innocent lives? You can rest easy, as I am not considering such an act, but I am very interested in knowing why the church has taken the stand on the issue that she has. Appreciate that song being led before Brad and the other ones that were brought as well. You know, it sounds pretty bad to come into this world and be placed in an animal food trough. Could be worse. Some children don't ever get to make it into this world because of the way that they're treated in the womb. And so I find very appropriate the song that's led in and God's watchful care that he desires to exercise over little children. For those who weren't here for the part one, sorry for that. But if you have interest in hearing the groundwork that's been laid for this second study, if you will, let me know. Let Marty know. Smile and wave. Let AJ know. Smile and wave. You don't have to let all of us know. Just let one of us know. These guys do the hard work, or if you want, you can communicate to me, and I can pass on to one of those. We can get you a copy of that lesson if you're interested in seeing what the initial part of that was. Just to reiterate where we are. Good news, I'm not going to repreach the lesson that we had a month ago. Woo, right? But I do want to just hit the cliff notes of the ideas that were shared. I want to say that in part for our visitors. I hate to sound like we're assuming anything. We haven't. We've had a whole study on this so far. So again, we can get you a copy if you're interested. But what we found biblically is this: God is the one who has put into place all life that exists. If you can imagine, Satan wants the opposite of what God wants. God wants life and life evermore. Satan wants death and yesterday. It's just the way he is. God, however, is opposed to the work of Satan. He hates it when people bring unlawful death or anyone works to do so, including Satan himself. A few important facts about human life. It can only exist whenever a spirit is inside of a body, which is quite significant when all recognize there is life inside of a mother's womb. Therefore, religiously and biblically, what does that tell us about a spirit? It has to have its own spirit, that body does, contained inside of us, or inside of the specimen. More than 40 times in the Bible, a baby inside the womb is spoken of just as that, in the same type of description that is used for life outside of the womb, letting us know that God views life inside of the womb in the same way that he sees life outside of the womb. For this reason, he will not ignore those who bring death to innocent children inside of the womb, and he will not tolerate it. Now, that's not bad, is it? It was just like a minute. So it was a lot faster than last time. But let's get on to fully answering the question today. Is it a good thing if someone kills an abortionist, one who is bringing death to many innocent young lives. God demands justice on the earth for everyone who is a murderer. Now, that doesn't mean we carry out his will and his desires, but that's what he desires to take place in this life. I want to start near the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, the book of beginnings. You have the beginning of physical things, the beginning of rocks and trees and water, the beginning of human life, the first marriage, the first sin, unfortunately, the first children, and then the first child makes a really bad decision with the second child. Genesis 4, starting in verse 8, Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and he killed him. And the Lord said to Cain, "Hey, haven't seen your brother around lately. Where is he?" And he said, "I don't know. Am I the one who's supposed to be keeping track of my brother? Why don't you ask him?" Well, God cuts to the chase, and he says, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed from the earth." And there are two ways of looking at this. One, what have you done? And as far as, your poor brother, and I think that's probably intended in part, but I think some of it he's asking, what have you done to yourself and to your life? Do you recognize the repercussions from this? I want to pause for just a moment and ask you to consider, what's the most valuable thing that you own? What's your most valuable commodity? For some of us, if we just started driving, we'd probably say, well, it's my vehicle. It's nothing impressive, but it's wheels, right? Gets me around. If we're married, maybe we have children. Maybe we're not married with children, but we might still say, probably my house. If we're later in life and we worked a full career and we've retired, we might say, it's my portfolio. That's my most valuable thing. And I would agree, depending on the stages of life, all those things are valuable, but I'm going to suggest that there's one thing that's more valuable to all of us. And I want to quote Jesus here. Matthew chapter 16, verse 26. What will a man give in exchange for his life? In some translations you have soul, coming from the Greek suke. Life is a good translation there. Soul works as well. So let's say you have this great set of wheels, but you don't have your life. Are you going to enjoy those wheels? You have a beautiful home, but you don't have your life. You going to live in it, your house? You have a great retirement account, but you don't have life. What are you going to do with all that money that you've saved up and invested through the years? Do you see the most valuable commodity for every one of us is our lives? Although, I would say, I think there's one thing to many of us that's even more valuable than our own lives. Raise your hand if you have a child. Raise your hand if you have a child. I better see a lot of hands going up. We have 53 of them, in case you're wondering, in this congregation. So better have a lot of hands that are going up right here. I'm not going to ask this question because I know it would be a unanimous answer. What's more important to you, your life or the life of your child? I know every parent in this room well enough to say everybody would answer, comparatively, I don't care about my life, even though it's so valuable to me. I care much more about my child's life. And now consider the God of heaven. And every one of us is his children. Every little baby that has been conceived is his. Do you just pass the care off of your child into the control of just anybody? And yet the God of heaven has shared with us these precious lives, what's most precious to him, of his children into our care. How are we going to choose to treat it? And not just our kids, our parents. How are we going to choose to treat that life? Our spouses. How are we going to choose to treat that life? Our brothers and our sisters. How do we choose to treat the precious life of that child of God that he in some way has entrusted to our care? Cain gets the opportunity, doesn't he? And he does the unthinkable. He works the will of Satan to bring unlawful death, and God asks him, what have you done? And yeah, it's awful. I mean, what you've done to your brother, in large part, I think he's asking, what have you done to yourself? And what this is going to mean for you going forward. You realize the curse that you've now brought upon yourself. I want to pause a second time and give a seemingly unrelated consideration. In the Bible, there are three major laws, time periods. There's the time when God communicates his will through the heads of the households and the fathers. Then he communicates his will through Moses, and then he does so through Jesus, his son. Do you know what the only law specifically taught in all three of these periods of time is? I know Roy knows. Does anyone else know? The only law, you might guess, it's probably love one another. That would make a lot of sense. That one's actually, we don't find that under the patriarchal law. I'm sure it was a part of it, don't misunderstand. But specifically enumerated, what's the only law given? And I'm going to show you. Genesis chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. Surely, this is under the time when God's talking to the heads of the households. This is the time period of Noah. That's about 2500 BC. Surely for your lifeblood I will demand a reckoning. From the hand of every beast I will require it, and from the hand of man. From the hand of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man, you see, we're not talking about an eternity. God's going to take care of things. That's true. He will. We're talking about in the time period lived on the earth. By man, God says, his blood shall be shed. For in the image of God, he made man. Our study is relative to innocent life that's found in the womb. So I want to ask this, where we're talking about the shedding of innocent blood to end a life. And the process that we know so well as abortion is there innocent blood that is shed to end a life? Yes, we realize that to be the case. If we lived in the time period of Noah, you know what would happen for someone who did so? His or her blood would be shed as well on the earth, because God says this is the way it is to be done. That's under the patriarchal system. Here's the law of Moses. Thank you, Carter, for the long, lengthy one. I'll just hit the cliff notes. Numbers 35, 29 through 34. These things shall be a statute of judgment throughout your generations in all dwellings. Whoever kills a person, the murderer, I do want to interject here, we're not talking about all killing, but just a certain kind, right? The context is unlawful killing, what violates God's law. Whoever kills a person, the murderer, shall be put to death. You shall take no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. You have to kill him. There's no other way going about it. You shall take no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge. You shall not pollute the land where you are, for blood defiles the land, innocent blood. No atonement can be made for the land for the blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. Do not defile the land which you inhabit, for I, the Lord, dwell among the children of Israel. Again, this is under the system of Moses, about 1,000 years after the reading of Genesis, the 9th chapter, and the procedure is exactly the same. If there's someone who has violated the privilege of life that God has given that individual, you have to kill that person because it's the only way to make things right. If someone unfairly took away someone else's right to live, then you have to fairly take away their right to live. And I want you to compare that to the way we tend to go about things in America. Now, we don't live under the law of Moses, but you shall take no ransom. There is no substitute for capital punishment. In the case of murder, you have to go through with it. Otherwise, your own land, your own country is in big trouble. How do we handle things today? Well, we have capital punishment in the United States. Not all states do it, but we do have capital punishment. I want to show you going back about to the year 1985. That was a great year. The best, if you ask me, 1985. So back in 1985, you're looking at roughly 72 months between the time a person is sentenced to die because of committing murder and the person has been found guilty, the sentence has been placed. There would be about 72 months before that execution would be carried out. 72 divided by 12 puts us at 6 years. Well, I mean, I could kind of understand that, couldn't you? I'm grateful for our appellate system. You know, a person needs to be able to look at things a little closer. And there have been a number of cases over years later, especially through the DNA evidence that we can test now. So those are positive things. People are actually innocent. I can see 6 years. Now you fast forward about 40 years later. I'm not going to tell you how I know 40 years is after 1985. Probably a lucky guess. But getting closer to our time period now, and you're looking at about 264 months between the time you're found definitely guilty of murder and you should die because you violated someone else's right to live until the time that you're executed. And you divide 12 into that, you realize the average time between someone's sentencing to die because they've been found guilty to when they actually die is more than 20 years after the sentence. There are lots of people who die of natural causes before they're ever punished for, in the way that has been prescribed for them. More than 20 years. That might be a little much, you think? Now, that's in cases when people are found to be sentenced to death. Usually, when you commit murder, you're not going to die for it in our country. In fact, the average prison sentence for someone who has committed murder, and of course that final judgment has already been handed out, the average prison sentence for murder is 229 months. Again, you do the math there, and you're probably going to spend less than 20 years in prison. If, say, you just hate someone, I got to get rid of them, all right, I'm going to give up 20 years of my life. Well, that's the sentence. That's not actually what's carried out. Through parole, the good behavior and type of stuff, reformation, we're looking usually more at like 16 years, which you break that down, divided by 12, it's about 15 years you're going to be in prison. Now that's today in the United States compared to how God looked at and dealt with murder in times past. Under the patriarchal law, you die, no exception. Under the Mosaic system, you're gone. If you violate someone's freedom to live, your freedom to live is taken away. What about today? Romans chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. For he, we'll talk about the he a little bit more in a moment. He is God's minister, someone, to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake. What he's saying is this: if you do the wrong thing wherever you live during this time period, the system of Christ, my will, God, is that I have people in place who are carrying around, in this time period, of course, swords, and I have authorized them to use them. Now, why do you think swords were being used in the first century? In the Bible, we're giants. They probably had giant teeth. You think they're using them as giant toothpicks to clean out their teeth? Well, what are these people doing with swords? They're using them to cut off people's heads. And God says, I've given him and authorized him the sword to use to end your life if you do evil. It's not specifically stated for what offense, but any guesses as to what that might include? Offenses that God would say, I'm okay with capital punishment for that. It's the only law found in all three of the systems. Capital punishment for offensive crimes that especially emphasized murder. Now, that's fascinating, isn't it? God demands justice in this place for those who unfairly take the lives of others. Okay, so does that mean I just get out my sword and I go find people, or today I pull out my gun and I go find people who I see are violating law or violating God's laws, and I take care of them myself? Not exactly. Romans chapter 13, I want to read a little bit more with verses 4 and 5 that we just did. Who is the he that God has authorized to carry around and to use deadly force? Romans 13, 1 through 4. Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist have been appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good. and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. God has put our governmental officials in place to keep law and order. Look, I'm going to be the first to admit that people who are in governmental positions, and especially in positions of power, say in law enforcement, I recognize there are some bad apples on the tree. I don't believe that's the norm, but there are going to be those who are found. We have to be careful, though, that we don't lose sight of the big picture and we decide, not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, okay? Just because there are some bad apples. I don't love everything that happens in government, but I am grateful for government. I don't love everything that happens in law enforcement, but I'm very grateful for it, and I proudly support law enforcement. Can you imagine what it would be like in our country or around the world if we had no governments and no police officers? If we had no court systems, what would it be like? You spend any time looking back at the old Wild West lately? Before there are really solid governments that are up in place for counties and for states and for provinces. Before there are enough sheriffs and deputies and marshals, it was a mess. I would say if there were no governments and no law enforcement, multiply the old Wild West by 10 and go try to enjoy life. Everyone's going to be on their own. It's just a giant, dangerous free-for-all. God has put governments in place to protect life. That's their duty, to protect law-abiding citizens. Does that always happen? Unfortunately, it doesn't always. Thankfully, normally, that is, though, what takes place. But what about if you have people who violate the power that's been entrusted to them? Do you then take matters into your own hands? I want to spend just a few minutes looking back at the life of a guy we know very well, the man called the individual after God's own heart, person of solid character. Not all was hunky-dory for King David back in the day. Prior to his days as a king, he led a pretty rough life. We read in 1 Samuel 23, verse 15, that David saw that Saul, that's the sitting king right now, David has been serving as a helper in the palace. He's been run out, and now this man, the king, is chasing him all over the countryside, seeking his life. We're told David was living in a wilderness of Ziph, in a forest. I'm going to save a lot of time and show you a picture that's worth 1,000 words. This is what David's life's been like the last many years. He starts out around where the king is from in Gibeah, and then he moves his way down. He has to leave the countryside, and he goes to the nation of the Philistines to find some refuge. He leaves there. He goes through a couple of wildernesses. He crosses over into the plains of Moab. He comes back. The short is he doesn't have rest wherever he goes. He's just running for his life, which I find really fascinating of itself. Why is the guy who stood up to the big, dangerous giant, the only guy, the one whom the king himself, Saul, was too afraid to face? The guy who was so brave and brought down the giant, went over, drew out his sword, and cut off his head with his own sword. That's a man. Why is he running from this guy who was too afraid to face the giant? Why would he be afraid of him? I would submit that David isn't running primarily because he's afraid of Saul, but because he respects Saul, not the person, the position, and he respects his God who put him in that position. 1 Samuel 24, verses 3 and 4, he comes to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. I've always thought that he's going to the bathroom. I think that's probably what it is. Some think he's tired and he goes in to sleep. All right. Whatever it is, he has needs and he's attending to those. David and his men were staying, though, in the recesses of the cave. Then the men of David said to him, "Hey, our master, David, this is it. This is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as it seems good to you." What thoughts do you think have been running through David's mind over these last several years. What would seem good for David to do to this man? The guy who, when he goes in to try to comfort his king in faithful service to him, he throws his javelin and tries to attach him to the wall and end his life through impalement. What would you think fit to do to that guy? The one who vows, because you risk your life in battle and you've killed double the enemies that he stipulated, and you're supposed to get his royal daughter in return. That's a promise that the king has made to you. And the day that you're going to be married to her, he humiliates you in front of the whole nation by giving her off to another man. What would you think fitting to do to that guy? The guy who, when you go in and you're playing your harp so beautifully and you're trying to comfort his bothered mind, and he chases you out and all through the countrysides, out of your nation into another, back into your nation, through the deserts, across the streams, the lakes, and you have no rest. What would you feel fit to do to that guy because he just wants to murder you? This is David's opportunity. Verses 4 through 6. So here David is, alone with the guy. He's not afraid of him. He can do to him whatever he wants. So David gets up and he takes his sword and he cuts off a little piece of cloth from his clothing. Well, that's weird. Now, it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. That's the kind of guy that David is. He hasn't even done him any harm, but he's like, I messed up his clothing. And he feels like he's sinned, and maybe he has from that. And he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master. Listen, I know he's not a great guy, but he's still my king, and I respect him for his position. And I respect him even more because he's the Lord's anointed. God has put him in that position. David knows that it's improper for him to act against the legal authorities because those legal authorities have been put in place by God. And David one day will be chief executive officer of the nation, but he's not there right now. And so he has no right to act in that way. And so he submits himself, even though he recognizes, listen, this guy deserves something even in this life for what he's done. But it's not my place to give it to him because I'm not in that position of justice to do so. That's the man after God's own heart. What about another guy who has murderous intentions utilized against him? His name? Jesus. He has God's own heart beating within him. Luke 22, verse 49, when those around saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, should we strike with the sword? And one of them didn't wait for the answer. He drew out his sword and he struck the servant of the high priest. He cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said to him, no. Matthew's rendition, he says, put your sword away. No, these are law enforcement officers. You let them do their job. Hopefully they do the right thing. If they don't, that's on them. But let them do their job and don't try to do their job for them. Put your sword away. He says, permit even this, and he touches the guy's ear and heals him. John later says, probably after Peter's death. The man who did this, by the way, is Peter. We kept that a secret until now. And then it's Peter who later writes these words, so impressed by it. 1 Peter 2, 22 and 23, Jesus committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he did commit himself to him who judges righteously. In other words, this was Jesus' procedure when we're dealing with conditions even involving murder. Number one, he says, I'm going to hand myself over willingly to the authorities. God has put these people in positions of power, and hopefully they do the right thing. So he hands himself over to the temple police or to the Roman soldiers. And the second thing is, he says, I entrust myself to the judicial system that God has put into place. Hopefully the courts of Rome do the right thing. Tragically, we know the courts of Rome abused their power. They perverted justice. So Jesus said this, I still entrust myself to another, but this time I'm doing it to the judge of heaven, the one who I know is going to right all wrongs. What does that mean for you and me as followers of the one who has the heart of God beating in his chest? Verse 21 of the same passage, for to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow his steps. So in application, when we encounter instances of murder or intentions of murder, what should we do? Number one, we should let law enforcement do what they do. And I do want to interject here, if you don't mind. I'm not talking about matters of self-defense. That's a whole other conversation, okay? I don't want anyone walking away thinking, oh, he said we can't defend ourselves anymore. The law of our land, as well as the law of our God, and I can show you that, authorizes potentially lethal force to protect one's person and one's loved ones. We're not talking about that. We're talking about trying to take justice into our own hands by bypassing measures of justice that God has put into place. What should we do involving murder or intentions of murder? Let law enforcement do what law enforcement is supposed to do, and hopefully they handle it the right way. Let the court systems do what God has set them up to do, and hopefully they do as they should. But what if they don't? Do you really think the judge of all the earth is going to let any wrong to go unpunished? Eventually it's going to be addressed, whether it's addressed in this life or not. Look, God never promised to us that we're going to have lives of ease while we're here. In fact, he's advertised completely the opposite. Same letter, same person, same experience. 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you, but rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. On their part, he's blasphemed, but on your part, he's glorified. He's saying, look, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you're going to escape any hardship. Life's going to be tough for you in moments as well. But when you suffer, make sure that the suffering that you're experiencing is because you're living like Christ and not the alternative. Verses 15 and 16, but let none of you suffer as or because you're a murderer, a thief, an evildoer, or as a busybody in other people's matters. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in this matter. Make sure that the suffering you're experiencing in this life is because you're living, exactly as Jesus would, and not because you're violating the will that he's laid out before you in the perfect example that you've seen lived out in him. Thank you for staying with me, because I want to bring this back now to our question. There have been many well-intentioned people through the years to see those who have unlawfully, by God's standard, ended innocent life in the womb and who wanted it to stop, and thinking that they're agents of Christ took matters into their own hands. And they would bomb abortion clinics or shoot them up, and doctors and nurses on the inside would be killed, and they would think, I did it in the service of Christ. I'm not going to question what the intentions have been. But I will say this, based on the example of Jesus and based on his teachings, the will of Christ has not been worked in these circumstances. Unwittingly, the same have simply put into practice the desires of the one who wants to end life, and especially in an illegal way, unlawfully, they're working the will of Satan. There is a proper way of going about it. I don't want anyone to leave here either thinking, oh, well, that means we just need to stay out of it. Happens. No, we need to work to do everything that we can to defend innocent life in every form, including in the womb. But it's not through taking justice into our own hands. It's through working through the government that God has set up, doing our best to try to shape public policy. You do know the midterm elections are coming up next year? Do a little research on what your representative and your senator, would say president, but that's going to be a couple more years, right? has done to protect innocent life in the womb. And if he or she hasn't done so, vote them out. If he or she has, stand behind them. Let them know you have my full support. I'm going to keep voting for you. Keep doing what you're doing. My understanding is in November of 26, we also have a unique opportunity in our state. 1973, Roe v. Wade was put into place nationwide, and for right at 50 years, more than 60 million innocent lives were lost inside the womb. Praise God that in 2022, Roe v. Wade was overturned. The decision then was put into the hands of the states instead of a centralized court system to make those decisions. I regret that last year our state voted essentially to re-implement Roe v. Wade in our state. You do realize that in November of 26, it's going to be on the ballot again. That's our opportunity. God has given us a voice in our nation and our state to stand up for innocent life. The founders of our country put in place the first two amendments they did for a reason. I'm a strong believer in the Second Amendment, just as they were, and you probably are too. The right to bear arms, but it's not number one for a reason. It's not the most powerful weapon that we have. They put it into place to protect the most powerful weapon there is, and that's the power of our voices. Let your voice be heard. Exercise what you can. Exercising through public policy and the electing of officials the legal way what we can do to protect innocent life. Don't get things turned around and number two. It's not the most powerful weapon we possess. Let's make sure that any suffering that takes place with us in this life is because we're standing for right and good, and not because we become hypocrites and murderers ourselves and unlawfully taking the lives of others, even if they have unlawfully taken other people's lives. Leave that to law enforcement, leave that to the courts to decide, and if they don't do the right thing, understand that in the next life, the judge of heaven is going to right all wrongs that have transpired here. The most important thing is that we live for Jesus and we live like Jesus in this place. The best thing that we can be known as in this life is not by our names, but by the name of Jesus as a Christian. Have you yet followed Christ in the example that He's left for you? I mentioned the great week that we had last week. Two young souls that love the Lord and want to live for Him. 2 souls that gave up their former identity and said, you know what, the only important name there is for me moving forward is Christian. There's no better life to live. There's no more perfect example to follow. Satan wants to bring death. He wants permanent death to be attached to us. Jesus fought death, and He overcame it as the life so that we can have life and have it more abundantly. If you want to pass from death into life, if you want to escape the snare of the one who loves death and to enter the one who is life Himself, come have it and more abundantly for yourself. Let's stand and sing to encourage all.